So welcome everyone to this webinar. My name's Christian Young. So agenda, just a few words from me around setting the context, and then we've got Dave and Andrew up there for about 20 minutes or so, which leaves a good amount of time to then get into the Q&A, which is really where the power and the feedback we've been getting from these particular forums, and then a little bit of a wrap up there at the end. So yes, there's two parts here. One, Impress Solutions, we're about mining safety and thought leadership in that space. And so that's where these webinars are coming from. Certainly the likes of what Andrew does and Dave does and others is really, really good. However, sometimes there's a bit of translation piece required for mining. So certainly that's the purpose of this particular platform. And there's a lot of themes thrown about and good conversation happening outside of mining, and we're trying to bring that closer together. So decluttering was one that popped up, one of Dave's previous webinar sharings, and so that was seen with quite positive. Let's explore that further. So that's how tonight's come about. And we have done some work previously. Dave did a lot of work there to share about high reliability organisation principles. So there will be some references back to that potentially throughout, but if you didn't sit through those, it's all good. I'm sure the themes will stand alone by themselves. There's some links there, which you'll get a copy of this presentation if you want to go and check that out further. So we've got two speakers tonight. For those that have heard Dave speak before on this particular platform, you'd be familiar with them, but for those who haven't, I'll introduce Dave and also Andrew. So Dave's done safety for a long time. He's a managing director of ForgeWorks, done a lot of international work, completed his doctorate on the identity practice and future of the safety profession, and is an adjunct research fellow at Griffith Uni. And Dave co-hosts the Safety of Work podcast with Dr. Drew Ray. So welcome, Dave. And then we've got Andrew. He helps health and safety professionals, teams and organisations perform better by learning how to learn better. And he's unconventional health and safety professional. He's got the Safety on Tap podcast, which is really good and helps people in the safety profession, learn and grow, as part of all of that. So, well, guys, appreciate your time, certainly, and sharing. And Andrew, I'll hand over control to you now, and I'll get off the line.
Fantastic. It's great to be here. And I suppose the number one thing for everyone on the call is that Dave and I are here 100% for you. So we delivered this same session, or the front end of the session, I should say, just last week at a big national conference. And it's kind of like when you're trying to be all things to all people, it means that you get a little bit that might be relevant to you. This is 100% focused on the mining sector. So please make sure that you are constructively selfish in the way that you ask your questions and poke and prod what we've got to kind of stimulate you at the beginning. So hopefully this works. We'll click that button. So we talk about safety clutter in the context of the elephant in the room, because Dave and I realised after having promoted the idea based on the research that he and a number of his colleagues put together, that the self-evident kind of reasons for tackling safety clutter and the damage that they causes are not enough for us to actually take action on it. And so we realised that we actually had a broader change and potentially mindset piece that we needed to explore. And that's some of the flavour of our session today, of what's holding us back that's not kind of self-evident. I'm just trying to work out these controls. Okay, cool. So let's talk about safety clutter in the first place and the definition. Now, most of the time when we look at the definition of safety clutter, people kind of intuitively get the concept. But the thing is that it's actually not a Netflix TV kind of pop culture concept. We're actually talking about something that's academically rigorous, and at the same time, it's really practically relevant in the real world. So it's not boffiny in that way. So the definition that comes out of the original 2018 paper, of which Dave was one of the key authors, one of the fathers of safety culture. So safety clutter is defined as the accumulation and persistence of safety work, I'll put that in bunny ears over here, that does not contribute to operational safety over here. And the key distinction there being that there is a difference between things that we do in the name of safety and things that are actual operational safety. Again, we kind of intuitively get that. This research helps us with some language and some models and some ways to take action on that. So that's what we mean by safety clutter. Now, before we go on, there's often this misconception that safety clutter, maybe because of the way that it's presented, maybe because of the language, maybe because of who talks about it or follows it, that it's kind of like a new view, safety two, safety differently kind of thing. It's not. Safety clutter is a really agnostic kind of concept to do with the management and practice of health and safety, irrespective of what religion you believe in. So when we say choose your story, I want you to bear that in mind in the sense that what we talk about, the language you use, the way that it makes sense in your head, and in particular, how you then translate this in your context, it's important to make sure that that story is relevant in your context. So it might need to be adapted. So when you choose your story, if you want to talk about safety differently, then it kind of fits with that ethical responsibility, not bureaucratic activity. If you want to talk about it in your team and you're trying to convince your team that safety clutter is something that we need to tackle and we need to get over some of the barriers that we'll talk about later, we can talk about it from an ethical point of view to say, as professionals, our ethical responsibility is to give priority to the health, safety, and welfare of employees. And so if we do anything that's not in aid of that, then is that ethical practice? Point here is that however you frame it, you want to make sure that it's relevant to the people that you're talking to. If you want to talk lean, then it's a form of waste. If you want to talk finance, it's a discretionary cost, which means that when you take it out, the business keeps running. And that's the unfortunate reality for some of us, especially at the moment. If you want to talk about operations, they just want us to stop wasting their effing time with this, that, or the other thing. So whatever it is, make sure it's relevant to your audience. Now, we've got thousands of data points from hundreds and hundreds of people just like you who've completed this safety clutter scorecard, which you can get at safetyclutter.com. It's like a tailored report you can get to help you understand and start a conversation about safety clutter. Now, one of the most interesting insights that we've discovered from this is the answers to this statement, how we rate our belief about whether my organization spends time doing things in the name of safety without actually improving safety. And these are the results. So 70% of our sample of people like us already recognize that it's a problem, right? So we see that safety clutter is an issue and we're diligent professionals, so we're going to do something about it, right? So let's then talk about a model for it. And this is kind of the back of the napkin way that I describe it to people in one slide in 1 minute. It's a little bit cheeky, but this is the basic concept. So safety clutter comes down to a model of 3 things that you need to understand, and it informs then your action. So the first one is the question of contribution. So what you need to ask is, to what extent does this process, activity, requirement, resource, whatever, contribute to the safety of work? The next question you need to ask is about confidence. So how confident are we that that contribution is a true contribution? And one way to think about this is what evidence do you have to back up what you're saying? So you can think about that as either the strength of belief internally within your organization based on your experience and data and your people, or you can look at it from an external point of view. So what external evidence is there for one thing or another? And then finally, the question that's probably the most important is about consensus. And you can't identify safety clutter without informing it by consensus of the people who are most relevant to understanding the safety of work, which is your front line, the people at the sharp end. So when you go through this process and you ask questions of, does this contribute to safety? How confident are we about that? And to what extent do we agree about that? You have this overlap in the middle, and then you've potentially identified safety clutter, and then you can do something about it. And you do that in a collaborative way. So that's kind of one slide, 1 minute. We've got a model. We know there's a problem, and yet so many of us are still not taking action on safety clutter. So Dave and I did then some further research with, again, health and safety professionals just like you. And we asked people to just give free response about what the fears, barriers, and objections are to decluttering. The top 3 are not going to surprise you. So this is thematically how we analysed it. Demonstrated compliance is the #1 most frequently cited reason for not tackling it. Losing something, losing data, losing knowledge, or causing harm because we remove something important. So it's almost like making a mistake when you declutter. This is the frequency of response of these things collectively in this data set. of about 101 responses. So the interesting thing about this is that we are more than twice as frequently mentioning the fact that we need to demonstrate compliance, and that's why we can't declutter, compared to maybe causing harm because we're courageous enough to declutter. So I suppose the thing about this research is that Dave and I recognize in this work that it might seem really pithy and straightforward to say, there's a model, there's a problem, let's take action. But these are very real fears, barriers, and objections that we have to work through as a change challenge. So when we then look at some of the words that we use in this same research about the fears that we have about decluttering, it's really interesting how emotional we are about it as well. So I think in that sense, it's useful for us as leaders to reflect on how we feel about this decluttering thing as much as kind of our rational brain and the way that that thinks about it. The thing is that despite how uncomfortable we are about it, how much faith we need, whether we're scared of loss or whether we're fearful of retribution because of something we do, clutter is dangerous. And and the research is really clear. It steals ownership, it's distracting, it's misleading, it erodes trust. And these are the sorts of things that Dave can touch on in his stories that he's going to tell in a minute about some practical case studies. And then we can open it up for your discussion as well to explore that. So it is a really dangerous problem that we need to tackle. Now, this number one challenge about compliance is something that we just can't ignore. And probably the best way for me to talk about that is really with this book, which I've got beside me very frequently, by Greg Smith, a lawyer that many of you would know from WA. He's been through his fair share of prosecutions and fatalities. And he describes this same challenge entirely independently of the work that Dave and his colleagues have done academically, about the legal perspective on the confusion between feeling safe because of the bureaucracy we create and then actually being safe. So when he talks about the way that we as a safety profession tackle this, and I should say also, Greg is a practicing safety professional as well. So right now, he is in a safety role as a safety lawyer. So it's not like he's a boffin either. And this is what he quotes from the book. And this, I suppose, is almost a launch pad for us to have some discussion about this. In most cases, bureaucracy does not manage legal risk, it increases it. Perhaps a starting point of this discussion is to have an honest conversation about how much we do in the name of health and safety is actually done in the name of legal risk management. And if we can distinguish those things, then hopefully we're going to have a much more fruitful way forward about taking action. Now, Dave's got 3 case studies for to kind of start to bring this stuff to life. And then we really quickly want to make sure that we spend the bulk of the rest of the session on your questions, concerns, challenges, and issues. So, Dave, over to you for the first story.
Thanks, Andrew. So, look, I think as we were like doing all different research projects at the uni, like Andrew said, and we started seeing these things that was happening in organisations in relation to safety, and we're trying to draw lines between all of that safety work and the safety of work, and people might be familiar with us using that language. Then we found all these things that we couldn't find that it actually helped the safety of work. So the obvious conclusion from a research point of view was, well, why are you doing it? Just remove it. And it became really clear very quickly that organisations just couldn't stop doing things for safety. And that's why we've, what Andrew's presented in terms of these fears and objections. I want to tell 3 stories, and I want to use those stories to try to highlight some of those fears, but also some of the ways forward. When you're approaching this idea of safety work and safety of work and safety clutter in organisations, my advice, you have to suspend your judgment. You almost have to assume that nothing works until you know that it does work, or everything works until you know that it doesn't work. So you have to just take yourself out of that equation and really start to try to observe what's actually going on. And start on the premise that managers and safety professionals do not know how work happens. We got invited by a mining company to visit one of their mines in PNG, and to help them with decluttering, and to help them sort of relook at their site, all of their site safety management practices and what went on. And the first thing that the site management and the safety professionals told me is, they wanted to get rid of their pre-start risk assessment equivalent process for that. And I sort of said, why? And they said, oh, well, we follow a global process, and the process is in English, and the work groups don't speak English. So it's obviously safety clutter. It's obviously not adding any value, takes up time every single day. We want to kind of remove it or redo it or something like that. And so I said, oh, so you don't get any of these filled out? And they said, no, we get over 300 of these things done a day in English. And I'm going, well, we got to find out what's going on first. So what I did is I spent another couple of days in the field And what was actually happening was all the supervisors spoke English, and with their work groups, what they would do at the start of every shift is lay out the cards in front of the people and go one by one around the work group and ask them what they actually wanted to write on their card in relation to safety for that day. And as they asked the second person, they'd say, oh, actually, we've already got that down on someone else. What else can you think of? What else could we do? What else do we have to worry about? And I say it is the best pre-start that I've seen in my career in terms of like managing risk and involving everyone in that and getting all the diversity of perspectives down. And so going back to that organization was, please don't do anything with this process. In fact, find ways to make sure that it stays like this, genuinely. So that first message is, when you're looking at things in your organization that you as a safety professional think might not be working, or that you think is working, you might find that it's the actual complete opposite. So that's why the consensus part of the safety clutter or decluttering process is so important, is, all of the different stakeholders, the management, the technical people, the workers, the safety professionals, all have to be on the same page about how safety work is done and how it contributes to the safety of work. So the second story that I wanted to talk about was there's a common misconception in, that's it. That was the cue, Andrew, to change the slide, mate, in case you missed that one. There's a common misconception that we hear a lot, and this was actually our biggest fear that went to point number 3, is that people just see decluttering as reducing the number of documents they have in their business. And I suppose we come from when we get the clutter out of our house, we throw more stuff in the bin, or we donate more stuff, or we recycle more stuff. So this is not right. So decluttering is all about value, and it's all about that contribution part of the equation, which is making sure that the things that we do in the name of safety in our organization are actually contributing to the safety of work. And it may actually involve more documents. We're working with one organization, unfortunately outside the mining industry, but it's a permit to work type process, which is directly relevant for your industry. And they'd set themselves a target of reducing their numbers as part of their decluttering, of reducing their number of documents by 40%. So what they've done is they've gone around their business, all their different business lines, they collected up all their permit to work processes, and they tried to write one overarching permit to work management process for the organization. And it kind of contains 7 subsections, or a generic section at the top, and then 7 subsections to try to cater for like the 7 different practices in the 7 different parts of the business. So now what had to happen was operational supervision and permit to work authorities had to refer people back and refer themselves and their process back to one document where only 1/7 or less of that document was actually relevant to what they did. So the first thing we did there in terms of helping them on the second part of their decluttering was say, no, actually, there's nothing wrong with 7 documents if you've got 7 different practices. In fact, you should have 7 different documents if you've got 7 different practices. And just sort of combining all these things to make it look, at least to the health and safety department or management, that there is less, may actually be creating more confusion and more effort for the people who need to actually use that to do work. So just remembering that decluttering is about value. It's not about volume. The third story I wanted to talk about was about decluttering at scale. And this was probably the last major change project I did before I left internal roles in companies. And the message I want to get here is, through that experience, that directors and regulators, will support your decluttering plan. Directors and regulators actually want you to declutter. And like from a director's point of view, whether it's their moral responsibility to their people, which I'm more and more convinced, as much as in the health and safety profession, we sometimes say that we think directors are there to cover their own backside. All the directors that we deal with are, care first and foremost about not hurting people. And they want to have risk reduction through their safety activities in their organization. So starting from that point of view. And secondly, like what Andrew introduced from Greg Smith, is that you're probably the more paper you've got in, the more processes, the more safety activities you've got that are, not done fully, you're probably exposing yourself to a little bit more risk, because not only did you identify the risk, but you put a specific process in place to follow, and your people weren't following it. So of course you're liable for that. So actually, directors support this. Regulators, this was an oil and gas story. Offshore, onshore regulators, state-based regulators, national regulators, went to each and every one of those regulators. I think there was 13 in total for this organization, engaged at very senior levels with those regulators, with those 13 regulators, told them the plan and what we're doing, negotiated what it meant for regulatory approved documents like safety cases and so on, and talked them through how we'd approach that together, what we were doing it, and the diligence with which we were doing it, aimed at creating greater risk reduction in our organization. And really, all that they were interested in was, we don't care what you do with all your internal processes, you just need to comply with our laws. So, I really think that when we look at some of the other analysis that's been done by like Deloitte Access Economics, which says that more than 60% of compliance requirements in business are self-imposed by business, not by regulation, means that the 2/3 of things that you do for safety in your organization are not actually directly related to an external regulatory requirement as it is. So look, there's some braver organizations than things that I've been involved in doing this. There's an organization that we work with that have now got a verbal pre-start risk assessment process. They do not do a written take 5. They took their regulator. They're another hazardous industry. They took their regulator on that journey. They did it in a controlled way, and they now have a verbal pre-start risk assessment process called a chat, where the work group get together and have a guided, facilitated conversation that they've trained their people in. And from a regulatory point of view, it's just, well, if we see it in action and when we talk to people, if they tell us how it's done, then it doesn't have to be written down. It doesn't have to be ticked off. It doesn't have to be recorded for it to be a system of work in the business. So look, there were 3 stories I wanted to talk to about. As managers and safety professionals, we don't know how work happens. Decluttering is about the value contribution of the activity to reducing risk in the business, not about reducing volume. And as much as we have it as a fear, our company directors and our regulators actually want us to remove the stuff that's not adding value and reinforce and shore up the things in our business that are adding value to reducing risk. So there's the stories, and there's the theory, and there's the challenge for us. And so what would be great now for the next half hour or so, Christian, is if we can dive in and see whether we've missed the mark or whether people have a few questions for us.
So, talking Queensland mining specific, I'm sure a lot of people have seen on the news that there's been a recent, significant event at Grosvenor Mine, which is Anglo-American pit in central Queensland. And there's been some other moving pieces here in Queensland, the regulatory perspective as well. So we've got obviously the industrial manslaughter flowing, in. It was already there, but upgraded, if you like. And then there was a big fatality report released in December 2019, whose purpose, and Dave, you talked about on one of your podcasts, was to look at the previous history of fatalities, to take away what can industry learn and move forwards with that. So I'm wondering, Dave or Andrew, your thoughts here. So we've got a fairly political climate, a lot of moving pieces, a lot of optics now on Queensland mining, but potentially further afield. In this context of decluttering, maybe some things that people could be thinking about, that if they wanted to move down this path, they could be cognizant of these other external factors, but so they could get buy-in from the people that they report to still, explore this.
Look, I think it's a good question. So I think this pressure to be better at safety is, I think, what you're talking about, Christian, is like, there's all this attention, extra attention and effort and feeling externally that safety needs to improve, and companies are probably a bit confused because they've been working really hard at it. Many of the companies within the industry probably feel like they're performing okay, but there's a lot of pressure to do more. Now, I suppose the question is how you translate that pressure into what you're going to do and how you're going to respond as an organization. And we've spoken a bit about this in the HRO webinars. From my perspective, I think using that pressure to bring your organization together is better than using it to kind of drive, to not drive value into your organization. And I see decluttering as a great way to bring your organization together. What it actually requires you to do is get your management and your workforce and your safety professionals together and say, let's just put our palms up on the table and say, what really happens in our business with these safety practices? Do you guys sit around on a Sunday night and have a couple of beers and fill out your take 5s for the week and then just drop one in the box every morning? Like how does this actually happen? we don't want to make you waste your time. We actually want to help you be safe. You guys tell us what's happening. And decluttering, I think, is a great lever to actually bring your organization together like that. Like we said in the HRO talks about sensitivity to operations and, understanding how work's actually happening and how your system's functioning. So I really don't see a downside. I think if you had to then defend that because something did go wrong and you were to lay out the approach you were taking to decluttering, remembering it's about alignment and understanding about the risk reduction contribution of your safety practices. I think someone like Greg Smith or Paul Catrone or Michael Toomer or any of these other OHS lawyers, in the country and in the region would love to defend a company like that. Love to put those people up on the stand and talk to them about what they were trying to achieve in their organization. So, Christian, I'm not sure what you had in mind by this question, but like Andrew said about decluttering being agnostic and what safety people should always have been doing, which is, making sure the things that we're doing and promoting and reinforcing and assuring in our organization are the things that are reducing risk.
I think, one of the takes for me is I love having these conversations with officers and with directors because it's really easy to actually articulate the argument for tackling safety clutter as a legitimate problem in relation to them discharging their duties. So understanding your operations and the hazards and risks involved. Ensuring that you provide resources that are appropriate, proportionate to that. I'm not getting the exact words right, but all of those concepts. Making sure that controls are in place. And control does not mean doing everything the same way everywhere. It's about controlling what is appropriate in relation to the risk. So decluttering actually fits really nicely with a better discharging of due diligence. And this goes to the point in Greg's book, and I recommend everyone get it, because he talks about this idea that when it goes wrong, then regulators drive trucks through all of the holes in your systems, through the boxes and boxes of pre-starts that never get looked at. And then they only have to talk to a handful of workers who go, the whole thing's a bureaucratic bullshit paperwork nightmare. And the case is done and dusted. So it's about kind of being more realistic about it. And one of the dangers associated with the discussions, especially in places like Queensland now, and we've seen this with the introduction of new laws in New Zealand in particular, is when lawyers drive the conversation, which is the logical thing for boards and executives to do, then safety have lost control over what is actually going to work. And so my recommendation would be is that we have to actually push very hard back against not having legal only conversations in that context.
Yeah, and I think, Andrew, just the last thing before the next question, Christian, maybe is let's remember with the independent government investigation into the BP incident in Macondo. So, and many of us are in international organisations, so we can talk about international jurisdictions. There's 7 different risk management practices that BP had in relation to safety on that rig. And, I think the quote in the report is that it was irresponsible for that organisation to believe that the people on that rig could have understood and been able to apply 7 different processes for different risk management practices within that rig. Actually said the clutter was irresponsible. So, there's ways you can cut this to deal with kind of some of these arguments, but we understand it's kind of a fear, and we need to have a good narrative around it.
Thanks very much, gents. And probably just as a final note there on that one, it looks like the Mines Inspectorate are also included to be reviewed as part of that parliamentary inquiry into what's happening there in Queensland. So interesting to be in the regulators side of things as well. Yep. Dave, you touched on the multinationals, and there's some questions here, certainly from Carlos and Dave talking about that. And I think you touched on some of those challenges there. So we've got multinationals that try to drive consistency and standardization, in their belief that it adds value, and then potentially that creates all of this churn and clutter. So maybe any other thoughts in that space?
Yeah, look, I think increasingly, I haven't worked for a multinational for a decade or more. And at the time it was actually not too bad because, I was in a regional role and the global health and safety requirements was like a 4-page guideline. And then the country managers the regional managers were told to, it was a local issue and it was told to be managed. So, then there wasn't a lot of clutter. You could really do something, but that's not really the case anymore. All the companies that we work with have, a very global view of their requirements and processes and practices for health and safety. I was talking to a company today with a very, very large organization, and we're doing some work with them, and they had worked for 3 years to develop their site assurance process. They developed the questions based on their risk, developed the questions based on their experience. They all understood it. They'd all worked it, and their global organization had decided that they wanted everyone to have a different assurance, first line assurance process, and mandated that they remove their own process and implement this global blanket one. And they're pissed, and it's adding way less value to safety at the moment, and not really helping anyone. But that organization can look across scan their global world and see everyone ticking the same boxes on the same form. That's silly, quite frankly, for organizations. And I think it's happening a lot in multinationals. I think it's a big problem.
I think it's a good opportunity maybe to link back for those of you who are in the HRO ones about this idea of mindful organizing, and this idea about kind of what are the sorts of things that we should be managing. So to paint a bit of a contrast, I was having a conversation with a senior HSC leader, one of my coaching clients recently, and we talked about this idea that in the corporate function, in that kind of at the head of whether it's multinational or multi-group business or whatever, that you've got to make a decision about what is going to be the most value laden thing you can do for the business. So, if all you've got in your hand is a hammer, then everything's going to look like a nail. So we've spent decades and decades doing systems related stuff and trying to achieve standardization and consistency, because that's what we need to demonstrate audit results. And you see how the system drives that behavior. Another contrast in this conversation, we said, well, what if the centralized function was actually a learning enabler? So what if they enabled the connection of insights across sites, across individual sites who have that autonomy that you just mentioned there, Dave? So it actually just changes the frame for what is your role. So instead of pushing out, standards and golden rules and whatever else, which are very well intentioned, it's just a case of maybe entertaining, well, going back to this idea about contribution, would it be more valuable for us as a centralized function to enable cross-business learning? That's an interesting question. And the point is not whether I'm right or whether that business is right. This process is actually a hypothesis-driven process. So in answer to the questions about, well, how would you do it in a multinational? It's a case of actually asking that question internally and then letting that feedback drive your approach.
Excellent. Thanks very much, guys, on that one. So maybe jumping on to pre-task risk assessment. Now, Dave, you mentioned that there, and maybe it's a step underneath that. There's some good questions there around that tension between, well, what adds value to the front line versus what does the organisation believe it needs to measure in terms of risk management and risk management tools, and perhaps pre-task risk assessment is one of those ones that's caught up in the middle of that. Certainly in the mining context, from my own experience and what I see, it's not the example that you gave in PNG, Dave. It's the other end of the scale. So interested in your thoughts in and around that.
Yeah, look, I think this comes up all the time when you talk about safety clutter. It talks about pre-starts, and I made the throwaway comment about filling in the week's pre-starts on the weekend or something. I also heard a story of someone who pays their kids, pocket money to do their pre-starts for them before they go to work in the morning over breakfast and things like that. These stories are real, and one brave person came and spoke at a safety conference in New South Wales, I think about 18 months ago, and told the whole audience of safety professionals exactly how the workforce treat pre-starts. And many people in that room, I think that was a shocking day for a number of people in that room. But look, let's go to what's going on here, and just give me a few minutes. So mental rehearsal pre-task has been shown to increase performance. It's shown to increase performance on the sporting field, at work. If you're at home and you're about to clean out the gutters, you're going to be sitting there going, what do I need to do? Okay, I need to get a ladder. How am I going to do it? What do I need for the job? Okay, I'm going to do this. So you're planning. So a pre-task risk assessment is this mental rehearsal process that's meant to go on between an individual or a group of people to set up that job for success or for safety. So what we do around that in organizations is we try to, we go, well, we don't know if everyone is capable of doing a good enough pre-task risk assessment. So we're going to give them a form or a procedure or a set of prompts to make sure they do a process as good as possible. So it's actually like that's something to actually shore up the process, which is a smart and sensible thing to do. What then happens with every process like this in the organization is that after a point in time, the process actually becomes the objective rather than the actual outcome of the process becoming the objective, which is always going to end up as a compliance tool. So what's happened, I think, to organizations with pre-starts is exactly that. The process is more important than the outcome because management and the safety professionals are looking at the process, very closely by recording those forms. There's actually a lot of management literature around this called transitional objects, which says that these take fives would be a really good transitional object while you teach someone how to do a pre-task risk assessment process, but then you should take it away before it becomes more about the process than the outcome. So that's what I was talking about. This organization that's now making this a verbal process said we've trained our people, in how to have this conversation. We're confident that they know what to do. So we don't want this to be about the form anymore. We actually want it to be about, the discussion and the outcome. So take the form away. So I think performing a pre-task risk assessment may be clutter in your organization. There's also the other reality that might exist, that the same form by two different people, one could be clutter and one could not be. One could be a tick and flick exercise, but you'll have people in your business that, do them very diligently and use them to inform, what happens. So again, this is something that clutter is not about just saying pre-task risk assessment is clutter, get it out of our business. And that's why you really need to spend the time going, okay, so how is this used? How do I know how it's used? How many people's insights have I got? What happens if we suddenly make the pre-task risk assessment optional for a week? Let's see who does it. So this is where we talk about experimenting with clutter removal and really trying to get some good data and good insight from people.
Andrew, did you have anything else, mate, you wanted to throw on the end of that?
The only thing I would say is I've delivered slides like this before where we actually included additional insights about what our data set says collectively as health and safety professionals are kind of some of the red button items of potential clutter. And I've taken it out because it's too easy for us to just go Control C, Control V. I'm just going to go and borrow that thing and then just plunk it into where I am. So just because someone else says a pre-start risk assessment is clutter in their organization, their context, their site or whatever, doesn't mean that it will for you. Just because this is probably a high candidate in lots of places, doesn't mean that it will for you. So it goes back to doing the work of actually seeking out the questions, the contribution, the confidence and the consensus in your context. It's a learning process.
Excellent. So there's a good comment made here too around being sensitive to, I guess, when you do find clutter and obvious clutter to stakeholders that may be the owners of that or the cause of that, or it could be some legacy aspects there. So maybe interested in your thoughts around, okay, once we do identify some clutter and we could probably all agree that it meets the requirements, what next in an effective way?
Tell your story, Dave. Tell people about how you had that conversation about you dismantling the stuff that you'd built in the past.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure exactly which story, but I was going to say I think the safety profession having a bit of humility and taking some responsibility for, whether it's them personally or whether it's us as a profession having created a lot of this stuff. And I think there's a question in there about, being sensitive because management, may have been the ones who've been directing a lot of this activity to happen in the past. So this is where, the skills of the safety professional to be able to say to their organization, look, we are really now, as we always should have been, focused on the value of all of our investment and resources dedicated to safety in terms of its contribution to risk reduction in the field. In our organization. And so, to do that, we're going to carefully go through all of the things that our that we're doing and understand how they're working and the effectiveness of how they're working. And I don't mean audit, I mean actually understanding how they're working. And so I think if the safety professional shares 51% of the responsibility for the situation being the way that it is, it kind of lets other people off the hook. So, you know, if you can give me more insight into the story that you're referring to, Andrew, I'll tell it again. But I think that's all I'd say is just own the problem, and then you take the need for others to to look bad away.
Yeah, no, I think that's the crux of it, Dave. I mean, you because you've been through that at Origin, when you had to basically say, you know, maybe what we have been doing needs to change. And I think that's kind of the point here, which is that if you engage your leaders in a conversation about what's the goal, then the rationale becomes self-evident. Now, if they've got concerns, which they probably should have concerns about, like the objections that we talked about, what if we take away something that's really important? What if we end up in court? Then what are we going to do? That's the conversation you've got to have as a health and safety leader, to actually take managers through and say, well, here is the process we're going to go through, and lay it out. So you can say, you know, if we went to our workforce and our workforce if we brought you the evidence to say most people think that something is not useful, one, are you open to changing it as the manager who makes decisions about that? And two, are you open to hearing their ideas about how to fix it, because they do it every day? It's very, very hard to get no's out of when you kind of step through those questions. Very hard, you know, unless you're kind of going bull at a gate, where there would be a real risk of going too fast, taking on too much, pushing too hard. But you know, we're really, really good at managing our stakeholders every day. So you'll get a sense of how hard and how far to push, but use the model to explain the logic.
Good commentary there. And I like what you talked about there, Dave, with humility on the behalf of a safety professional, definitely in that space. An observation that I'll make too is some organisations that I've seen. So, for example, one, they've got 7,000 work instructions for a single site. So, yes, there's clutter, but the volume of that is almost crippling, sort of thing. That's a massive project to go down that path. So we had there's some good comments there, as you can see in the chat. Sort of two people, Stacey and Declutter Yourself, if I pronounce that name correctly, talking about, you know, remote safety and engagement there. So if we've got people either in a different working location to the central function or to a hub, and has that caused then potentially some clutter to be introduced to be able to support those processes? And maybe by extension, with some of the technology changes coming in, are we almost starting to default to our normal process there and create clutter just because, well, some new technology, we've got to manage the risk, etc. So comments in that space?
Oh, look, I think no doubt, no doubt there's more clutter in some organisations as a result of the current working arrangements, and no doubt there's probably less in others. I don't really know what it would look like. All I know is I tried to go away. Well, I did go away for the weekend with the family, and I had to sign that I understood a 4-page document about how to wash my hands while I was staying at this sort of shared B&B hotel sort of thing on the weekend. And so, you know, it's just kind of this clutter and this liability management and all this other stuff that we talk about. So there's no doubt there's going to be a lot of that creeping in. But I think a lot of organizations have found ways to get around that. I know now that Cam Stevens has made himself known on the call, there was a comment in there about, you know, in the mining sector, it can be hard for safety professionals and managers to actually access the work front. You know, guys and girls driving trucks and underground and things like that. It can be hard to get to work as done. You know, there's lots of emerging and not so new technology solutions that can help you get an insight into what's happening in the field that, you know, could really help a safety professional get to understand about what's going on. So yeah, look, that's all I try to say is you have to find ways to understand how people are actually interacting with your safety management processes.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Again, I'll go back to one of the HRO principles about trust, and it's this idea that we can actually trust a worker who does a job every single day to actually have a valuable insight greater than whatever our insight might be. So we may very well need to make sure that there's some kind of legal compliance met or some system alignment or whatnot, but we have to trust those people that they're going to have something valuable to say, and they almost always do. Maybe not every single individual person, but collectively, when we actually tap into that, then we learn shitloads more. This is, I mean, I think the technology stuff is interesting, especially where it is difficult to actually get all the way there. But there's always people there. So that sitting down in the lunchroom with people when you're on the plane, to or from site, picking up the phone and having a conversation with someone, being humble in that inquiry, they're not difficult sorts of things. And what I would say about that is that that takes time to do, and it's effortful to do. In which case we have to actually have a look at what we might be able to take out of our own calendar, potential clutter in our own work, in order to create some space for some of these things to happen. So this idea that clutter can exist at multiple levels, there's kind of this organizational level one, and then there's this process or activity level one, and then there's the individual level one for health and safety professionals. It's worth considering.
Christian, can I steal? I know we're running out of time. Can I actually jump on one of the threads that's coming through in the chat here about critical steps?
Go for it.
So there was I think something that started up with Carlos about managing major hazard facilities in decluttering, and then Cam Stevens jumped in and introduced the idea of critical steps. And there's been a bit of chat about that. And the point that I wanted to pick up on was about integrating safety management into work and work management. We've talked a long time about integration in safety. And a pre-start's a perfect example of not integrating safety in the way work happens. It's like, do it at the start of the day and then get on and do your job. And in research where we've looked at pre-starts and removing pre-starts, what we've actually found is when you take the pre-start away, you actually see safety being integrated throughout the day. It's almost like when people do the pre-start and sign it off and think it's okay, maybe they've lost the first half an hour of their shift, they actually work less safely following doing a pre-start than work crews that don't do pre-starts. And that's a research finding in terms of compliance behaviours and safe behaviours in sort of in controlled trials, paper not yet published. So this idea about integrating safety into work. So we work with one organisation, and critical risk control is really popular in mining. ICMM have been on about it for, I don't know, a decade. You guys all know about it. That's not integrating safety into work. And this is where these critical steps come in. We're talking to a company that's going to have 9 critical risks, and they're going to have 9 critical risk controls. But some tasks involve 5 or 6 of those different types of risks. So that means they're going to have to do what is actually only about a 1-hour job. They're actually going to have to do 5 or 6 critical control checks. And I said, well, people don't think about work in the context of these 5 risks. They think about work in terms of the tasks that they're actually about to complete. So I said, wouldn't it be better to look at their normal maintenance tasks, because it's fairly routine, and look at what the specific critical steps are for safety associated with each of those tasks? And the safety department said to me, oh, but they have about 400 standard tasks. That means we'd have to look at 400 things. I said, yeah. So you're saying that actually you being kind of lazy is more important than actually contributing to, the safety of work of your workforce by going through those 400 things and telling people the 4 or 5 steps that they need to make sure happen when they're doing that job. And that's that idea about critical steps, where it's not about critical risk, it's about critical steps associated with an activity. What kind of gateways or bottlenecks to work activities need to go through to make sure that they're safe? And there's some really great work happening in a number of different industries in this place, in this space, really dynamic industries, to say, actually, this task can be performed in 100 different ways. But it doesn't matter which 100 different ways you choose to perform it, you need to hit these 4 things at these 4 times. And you're an experienced, competent person, you figure out the rest. And I think those things are the future of safety, and it's sort of emerging now. And I think if you're looking, if you're not happy with the way your critical risk program's working, there's other options. And if you haven't done one yet, critical risk is sort of a 10-year-old idea, and there's better ideas out there that provide your organisation with less clutter. So sorry about the rant, Christian, and sorry about hijacking that. But since someone else mentioned critical steps, I thought we'd we'd have a quick chat about it.
That's excellent. Well, so it's 5 minutes to go, so we'll move to the wrap-up stage now. And please, if people still have any questions, then throw them on the log, and after this, we can get a response from Dave and Andrew. So where to next? So we had the link here, Andrew, Dave, and I guess it's an open invitation there for people who haven't gone down this space to go and access the link and try it out.
So it's interesting. So if you had to think about implementation of a new safety system, right, or critical controls, let's say, then how do you have that conversation to justify why it should deserve time and resources and attention? So it's the same kind of thing with safety clutter, where we've used effectively the evidence-based process to allow you to go online, go through and answer these questions about the potential for safety clutter in your context, and then get a nice report that kind of wraps the results up in as plain a language as we can in order to help you to make sense of the safety clutter concept, so that then you can take this report, hopefully, and then start to have some conversations. So going online and doing a free thing is not going to help you declutter your organization. Let's be realistic. But the first step is having a conversation, and you are the most important person in that conversation, because you've got to be compelling and clear about why safety clutter is a problem and what we can do about it.
Thanks, Andrew. Look, so we are impressed. Definitely, we've only just recently started this series that we're getting good feedback, finding great people, great topics, and certainly maybe I'll add in critical steps in there as a term too. Maybe we can weave that in, into future topics, and potentially based on feedback, there might even be a part 2 around this decluttering. Certainly, if people went away and did some reflective thinking, then does it create space for us to loop back again, potentially down the path. But certainly happy to take any feedback there around any of these types of topics or anything different there in terms of topics. People in Queensland, there's actually a safety forum happening 15th of October. We're really trying to get, again, good people to come there and industry sharing with industry, probably that frontline stuff, not so much the academic. Any final thoughts from yourself, Andrew, and then Dave?
I would say that there's a high proportion that a lot of us aren't going to really change anything as a result of what you've heard tonight. And so what I'd encourage you to do, if you go and do the safety clutter scorecard, then Dave and I are more than happy to actually come back and we can do an entire session just on your questions and issues or whatever, because I know that it kind of went pretty quick now. That's the best way to actually help the change happen in your context, is to kind of make it tailored. So I think Dave would be open to that, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And Christian and I had made the same offer about HRO conversations, and I think any one of us are sort of looking for people to talk to outside our own homes at the moment. So that sounds like a great thing to do. All I'd say as a final step is, and the last minute is, have the conversation with someone in your organization who you believe you can have an open conversation with. Story I tell is I hopped in a lift once with the chairman of a company, and the first question he asked me was, "How's our TRIFR?" And I said, "Mate, like, of all the conversations we could have in the next 3 minutes about safety, why do you want to know about TRIFR?" And he said, "Because that's what you guys always talk about. I'm just showing you that I'm taking an interest in safety." So, "Mate, I'm not interested in TRIFR." And he goes, "Well, neither am I. It doesn't really tell me anything about the business." So, don't assume that people in your organization aren't up for this type of conversation about what adds value at any level. So I'd encourage you to at least, start to have the conversation with people that you trust, you can speak openly to, and you might be surprised at how quickly this gets legs.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks guys. So Andrew, thank you for your time. Dave, thank you for your time and sharing. And for people that took an hour out of their Wednesday night, thank you also for joining me. I really appreciate it. So hopefully you've got some value out of that, and looking at some of the comments there, it looks like everyone did. So thank you. That's it for tonight, and probably chat again soon. So bye-bye.